Hello! I've never mentioned it on this channel, but I am moderately interested in analyzing fiction. One of the difficulties of writing fiction is writing genius characters, because these characters are supposed to be more intelligent than the author themselves. While I was mulling over this problem, it occurred to me that the intelligence Jesus displays in the Gospels is rather unique. The idea here is that it's useful when analyzing fiction to construct a framework for organizing the various kinds of intelligence displayed by characters. But Jesus doesn't actually fit into this framework. I want to be upfront, this video does have some apologetic significance. My analysis suggests that the Gospels aren't fictional. They veridically report the life of an unusually intelligent man. However, this is by no means the strongest argument in the world. Ultimately, I think that the main value of this video is that I provide a bit of literary analysis of the Gospels, and you might learn something about fictional intelligent characters, and the non-fictional intelligence of Jesus. Hope you enjoy. Okay, first, let's talk about intelligent characters in fiction. If you're writing an intelligent character, they should be faced with difficult problems with no obvious solutions. If the problem has obvious solutions, then your character isn't actually displaying intelligence when they solve them. So, you throw a difficult problem at your character, and then they solve the problem. Congratulations, your character is intelligent. Now, here's the framework you can use to distinguish between a well-written intelligent character and a poorly written intelligent character. Here it is. Does the audience understand why the solution worked? I'll give two examples to illustrate why this is so important. I heard a story of an ancient general whose army was running out of arrows while the enemy army had plenty of arrows. The general didn't order his men to make more arrows. He ordered them to construct rafts with scarecrows on them and float them down the river at night. The enemy army, mistaking the scarecrows for soldiers, fired at the rafts. The general then collected the rafts at the other side of the river and harvested the arrows embedded in the rafts. This has all the makings of well-written intelligence, because the problem of not enough arrows has no obvious solution. Yet you, the audience, can understand why the general's solution worked. Now, let's look at an example of poorly written intelligence. There's a particular detective show I never watched, but I heard about it because the detective's intelligence was famously poorly written. For example, the detective might see a man with a limp and then correctly deduce that the man was ex-military. Now, figuring out a man's past based solely on their appearance is indeed a difficult problem with no obvious solution, and the detective character solved this problem. They successfully figured out the man's past. But the detective's intelligence in this case is poorly written, because the detective's success doesn't make sense in retrospect. Maybe a man with a limp could have a military background, or maybe he was just in a car accident, or maybe he had an ingrown toenail, or any one of 1,000 other possible explanations. Having your character successfully solve a problem isn't enough. The audience should understand why the solution was successful, rather than unsuccessful. If the character makes a leap in logic, or their master plan depends on some coincidence occurring, then the audience won't think the solution worked because the character was so smart. They'll think the solution worked because the writer needed the solution to work. This breaks immersion and is bad for your story. I like to call these two types of intelligence high-effort intelligence and low-effort intelligence. It takes a lot of work to come up with a non-obvious solution to a problem that the audience can nonetheless understand in retrospect. But it's really easy to just have the character make up a random solution, then you write, and it worked because the character is just so smart. Now, there's a trick to low-effort intelligence. There's a way you can have your cake and eat it too. Give your fictional character some excuse as to why it's impossible for others to understand why their solutions work. Maybe your character is just so intelligent and their plans are so detailed that they can't be explained to the audience. One common example of this is super genius villains. A bunch of complicated events unfold and the villain just rubs their hands together and says, "Yes, yes, all according to my master plan." The audience just accepts it because they've been given some reason to not question it any deeper. Knowing that this plan would work is basically just the villain's superpower. To summarize, whenever your character comes up with a solution and it's not clear why the solution actually works, the audience can see the hand of the author, which breaks immersion. But it's possible to disguise the hand of the author as something else, like a superpower. So you can give your character high effort intelligence, which is good writing. You can give them low effort intelligence, which is bad writing. Or you can give them excused low effort intelligence, which I personally think is somewhere in between. Now, which of these types of intelligence does Jesus display in the Gospels? Well, none of them. First of all, Jesus is God. He has an excuse to come up with any solution to any problem, no matter how random, and the audience will understand that his solution worked because he's God. End of discussion. You don't need anything more than that. For example, multiple times in the Gospels, Jesus is going to be arrested, but he wasn't because his hour had not yet come. There's another time when people are going to throw Jesus off a cliff, but instead of that happening, get this, it actually didn't happen. Why would you need any more than that? He's God. If he doesn't want to be arrested today, he's not going to be arrested today. If you are confused as to why they did not successfully push him off the cliff, you haven't been reading very closely. So, the Gospels have exactly the sort of setup that they need to give Jesus excused low-effort intelligence. A gold-plated excuse comes built into the person of Jesus. But despite having the excuse to end all excuses, Jesus does not display low-effort intelligence. He displays high-effort intelligence. The examples of this are numerous, and I'd like to take some time to go through a couple right now. The first one has to be the time when the Pharisees asked Jesus if they should pay taxes to Caesar. Jesus apparently has two options. Firstly, he can say, yes, pay your taxes, and he would instantly lose all his popularity because the crowd listening to Jesus liked having money. Secondly, he can say, no, don't pay your taxes, after which he would be killed because Caesar liked having money. This is a problem that has no obvious solution. What does Jesus do? Well, he asks whose image is on their coins. They say Caesar's. Then Jesus says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. Now, this totally escapes the Pharisees' traps, but it's so subtle that it took me a while to figure out how to even put it into words. First, you should note that Jesus' declaration doesn't say anything meaningful in isolation, because it's almost a tautology. Of course Caesar should get Caesar's stuff, and God should get God's stuff. But this statement implicitly begs a question. What is Caesar's stuff and what is God's stuff? And since the Pharisees just pointed out that coins have Caesar's face on them, Jesus just reframed their innocuous observation as a claim that coins are Caesar's stuff. In effect, he tricked the Pharisees into being the ones saying you had to pay taxes. So what can the Pharisees do in response? Clarify that they were just engaging in some recreational facial recognition and that actually we're not going to give them to Caesar? Remember, in the game that they're playing, the first person to promote tax evasion gets crucified. On another level, since Jesus' answer is buried beneath a couple layers of implied inferences, it forces the people listening to his words to chew on what he's saying. The audience can only understand what Jesus is saying after they complete a chain of reasoning. But this subtly shifts the dynamic. Now, instead of feeling like they're being told that they should pay taxes, they feel like they discovered that they should pay taxes. And at any rate, a contemplative crowd is not in a mindset conducive to being whipped up into an angry mob. And after all of that masterful maneuvering, there is still a deeper level to Jesus' words. If we can figure out what stuff belongs to Caesar by finding the stuff with Caesar's image on it, this implies that we could figure out what stuff belongs to God by finding the stuff with God's image on it. And humans are said to be made in the image of God, so you are supposed to give yourself to God. Jesus was forced into a political trap, and he turns it into an opportunity for discussing spiritual truth. In retrospect, we can totally understand the inner workings of Jesus' solution to this difficult problem. Another example of Jesus displaying high-effort intelligence occurs when Jesus decides to heal a man with a shriveled hand on the Sabbath. The trap here is that if Jesus does heal the man, the Pharisees are going to charge Jesus with violating the Sabbath, because you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath, and arguably miraculous healing sort of counts as working if you squint. So, before healing the guy, Jesus asks, is it lawful to do good or evil on the Sabbath, to give life or to take it? Now, Jesus' question equates saving life with doing good. There's a premise implicit in his question, and since he framed it as a question, he is inviting objections. But how can the Pharisees object? They can't say, actually, saving life is bad, because that makes you sound like a horrible person. So they don't say anything. Jesus then heals the guy's hand, which reframes their silence as implicit agreement with Jesus' actions. He gave them all a chance to tell him why healing is bad, and they passed it up. So now they have no ground on which they can condemn him. This is super impressive. Jesus trapped the Pharisees into being unable to object to him with a single question. There's one example where the Gospels themselves take the time to explain why Jesus' solution worked so well. The Pharisees come to Jesus asking where his authority comes from. Jesus asks them a question first. Where did John the Baptist get his authority? They can't say John the Baptist had divine authority because the Pharisees don't want to legitimize John. But they don't want to say John was just making stuff up because John was really popular with the crowd of people surrounding them. So they tell Jesus that they aren't going to answer him. Fair enough, but then he isn't going to answer them either. Jesus just boxes in the Pharisees with a couple sentences, over and over. And it's not like the Pharisees are giving him softballs. These are actually difficult traps. I want to emphasize that point. With the benefit of hindsight, it's sometimes easy to underestimate how difficult a problem is. Like, come on, why would you even worry about getting more arrows for your army? Don't you know that the enemy army is basically a free arrow machine? Yeah, once you've heard that that was an option, it's an obvious option. But try to imagine how impossible these problems would have seemed without the benefit of hindsight. Personally, if I were in Jesus' shoes, I probably would have been killed by an angry mob for telling them to pay taxes, and I'd have gotten into a shouting match about why miracles don't count as work since they violate the law of conservation of energy. So, Jesus frequently displayed high-effort intelligence. Interestingly, it appears to be more rare in the Gospel of John. This makes sense. The Gospel of John focuses on Jesus' divinity more than the other Gospels. And while winning a debate with awesome rhetorical skills is impressive, that doesn't point to divinity as strongly as winning a debate by reading an opponent's mind and performing miracles. But it should be noted that in every Gospel, we see a mixture of Jesus solving problems with high-effort intelligence and solving problems with a divine trump card. For example, in the Synoptics, when the paralytic was lowered through the roof and Jesus healed his sins, Jesus did not then proceed to engage in witty banter with the Pharisees. He basically just says, I read your mind, and you're skeptical that I have the authority to forgive sins. In rebuttal, I'm going to violate the laws of physics. And he heals the paralytic. The Gospels consistently show us a mixture of Jesus solving problems with high-effort intelligence and Jesus solving problems more directly with divine power. John happened to write a gospel that focused on the latter kind of interaction. But there are examples of Jesus displaying high-effort intelligence in the Gospel of John. One example is in John 6. Jesus had just fed the 5,000, and then he went away to the other side of a lake. Some of those 5,000 follow him, so he starts to preach to them. But it quickly becomes obvious that these guys follow Jesus because they want him to make more food for them. They basically tell him, hey, we would believe you, but we need you to prove yourself with a miracle. And wouldn't you know it, I just so happened to be reading the Torah, and I came across the miracle of manna coming from heaven and feeding everyone. I think that if you were, hypothetically, to perform a miracle, then maybe you could try doing that one that I selected totally at random. And every time Jesus tries to talk about something spiritual, they try talking about food. This is a difficult problem with no obvious solution. So then Jesus basically says, I am bread, eat my flesh. This immediately solves the problem. Because he claimed that his body is food, it doesn't make sense for them to keep asking for food until they first work out what he actually means by that. So the crowd is forced to interact with the spiritual truths behind the claims he's making. Plus, since his claim is rather shocking, it's forcing the audience to, pardon the pun, chew on his words. So, with one sentence, he took a group of people who only wanted to talk about food and cornered them into talking about spiritual matters. This seems to me to be a clear example of the sort of high-effort intelligence we see in the Synoptics. What's interesting here is that this example is an instance of not only Jesus displaying high effort intelligence, but also an instance of Jesus making a radical claim about himself. The Gospel of John has many I am statements. If I had to guess, I think that this is John's main motive of including this interaction, rather than his expertise in handling the crowd. It seems that Jesus' high-effort intelligence is of secondary importance in the Gospel of John, but it still shines through simply because that's who Jesus is. Alright, so that's my analysis of Jesus' intelligence. He has, well, excused high-effort intelligence, which shouldn't really be a thing. If the reports of Jesus in the Gospels are primarily fictional, you would expect Jesus to have excused low-effort intelligence, since that's easier to write and would have been perfectly acceptable to the original audience. However, if the reports of Jesus in the Gospels are reliable, Jesus is a very intelligent person, so it would make sense for Jesus to display high-effort intelligence even if an excuse for low-effort intelligence existed. Put another way, making up stories of Jesus masterfully defeating the Pharisees was more trouble than it was worth. So these portions of the Gospels are probably reliable. Now, this is only a probabilistic argument. It isn't ironclad. I'm sure there are examples of excused high-effort intelligence somewhere in fiction. It's just a lot more rare than the other three kinds of intelligence. You need to be a good writer to write high-effort intelligence, and the incentive for it is undercut when an excuse for low-effort intelligence exists. So, I think that my analysis indicates that Jesus' displays of intelligence in the Gospels are true. Now, many people fail to understand that the reliability of the Gospels is all tied together. If one part of a Gospel can be shown to be unreliable, this casts doubt on the whole Gospel. But the converse is also true. If one part of a Gospel is shown to be reliable, this should increase one's confidence that the Gospel is reliable overall. That's how testimony works. So that's why I think that the unusual intelligence of Jesus does have apologetics value. Although if nothing else, it shows that the Gospels are unusually well written, and I've hopefully given you, the viewer, something to think about. Anyways, that's the end of this video. Thanks for watching. Remember, Christ died for our sins and rose from the dead. Goodbye.